they identify with what they are doing, what we are doing here. And I was told that I share that with you so that perhaps you can appreciate some of the sacrifices some of the faculty is bringing in order to make the lecture series possible, because that somehow at times is being swept under the carpet, and I don't think it should be swept under the carpet. Then we have some handouts up there. Those of you who might be interested in a paper, they gave us some copies of the paper which deals with Jewish affairs. We do that simply out of kindness. You are more than welcome to it at no cost. They just want to show us what they are doing. So if you want to take advantage of it, just take a copy.
We'll leave it on this back table.
That's right. It's going to be on this back table.
The first paper is due for people in the history department section. Please give it to me today. I'll be here during the break.
That also applies to people who are in education and sociology.
And extended ed.
Well, that's what I said, education, extended ed. So think, extended ed, education, and sociology. And the other faculty members who sit there can also tell when to get their papers.
Yes, sir.
Today. His Socratic Majesty said today. Yes.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the fifth of the series of 15 lectures on the Holocaust. My name is Judy Clark, and I'm a member at large of the Alliance for the Holocaust, which is, just to remind you, a coalition of 15 community organizations in Marin, Mendocino, Napa, and Sonoma County, and an affiliate of the Sonoma State University. Today's subject is, as you may see from your lecture series, Contemporary German Attitude. We have 4 panel members. We have Dr. Philip Baird, full professor, the German department, the university. Dr. Sterling Bennett, also a full professor, German department. We have Ms. Ilka Hartmann, an instructor of German in the German department. And we have Dr. Steiner, who is the director of the Holocaust Study Center at Sonoma State University. The members of this panel are eminently qualified to discuss this subject, not only because of their connection with the German department, but because they have traveled extensively in Germany, they have studied this subject, they are in contact with Germany, correspondence, periodicals, and newspapers. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's panel. I also want to let you know that after the lecture is over, we will have a question period and there'll be a moderator.
Well, we've decided that I'm going to start, and Sterling will follow me, and then Ilka, and finally John will wrap things up today. I'm quite concerned about time and worried that we won't all get into the time that we've got, everything that we want to say. So I'm going to just can the sensitive, pensive introduction that I had prepared and get straight into one of the two main things that I want to do. This first thing is a sort of an experimental result of some puzzlings of my own on the Holocaust that I hope you will get some value from. The second thing with which I will conclude my segment of the presentation is I want to read you some excerpts from the landmark speech given by Richard von Weizsäcker, the President of the Federal Republic of Germany, on May 8th, 1985. Okay. My puzzlings that I hope will be useful to you. I want to set up what I hope may someday become a useful model for examining Holocaust-related topics. And these puzzlings of mine go beyond the question of German attitudes, contemporary German attitudes about the Holocaust, which is our topic for today. But I think they shed considerable light on that topic and on generally human attitudes towards genocide as well. They have nature and practice of evil. It's a word that's come up various times already this semester and in previous semesters, but we haven't talked about it much specifically. Evil, of which, as we know, the Holocaust offers us a widely recognized paradigm. I want to suggest 4 propositions for your consideration, and I'll write them on the board. I hasten to add that I'm not yet sure of the extent of their validity and of what other similar propositions might perhaps be added to them or substituted for them. They are descriptive positions, not prescriptive, but as I see it, their strength lies in the basis that they provide for analysis and action of the type we need if we are to prevent future Holocausts and preserve some vestige of civilized life on our planet. First, let me start with a simple definition of evil, which I take from M. Scott Peck's book called The People of the Lie. A study of evil, which I recommend with some qualification to you. It takes on some very difficult issues in psychology and psychiatry, and does I think, a fair to good job of shedding light on the question of evil and how it's practiced. His definition, thumbnail definition, this is a shortened version of it, is evil is the unnecessary destruction of and liveliness. Unnecessary destruction of life and liveliness, to which I would add as my own personal corollary, evil is the causing of unnecessary suffering. Now, with that thumbnail definition of evil to guide us, let me write here for you these propositions that I would like to examine. 1. Evil is banal. It has an everyday face. 2. Perpetrators of evil deny their role in it. 3, evil is systemic. And 4, war promotes and exacerbates evil. Okay, as regards this first proposition, that evil is banal and has an everyday face, recall, if you will, René's introductory words early in the film Night and Fog. Quote, "A Sunday afternoon stroll in the country leads to a concentration camp," or words to that. Evil looms up in the midst of everyday reality, even in the midst of a bucolic idyll. The boundaries between evil and normality are much trickier to discern than we like to admit. Peck, in People of the Lie, points out that people who, on closer scrutiny, are clearly doing evil usually look and sound perfectly respectable. Most SS extermination camp bosses had nice wives and families and pets. They were law-abiding citizens, etc. They were anything but the mad dogs we would prefer to see. One of the most difficult things to comprehend about the Holocaust was the non-spectacular, workaday way that it functioned. The only difference between it and a mass-scale, mundane slaughterhouse was that its victims were not cattle, except that the Nazi ideology had in effect defined them as cattle, or worse. And the penalties were great for acting as if they weren't cattle. Number 2, perpetrators of evil deny their role in it. This is a much harder one to deal with than meets the eye, because we're all deniers. Like it or not, we are all implicated in evil in some way and to some degree, a degree almost always greater than we're willing to admit. Case in point, the victims of the recent bombing of the air raid shelter or bunker in Baghdad all experienced their own personal Holocaust with a small h. There can be no question that in their own minds and those of their families, friends, and compatriots, evil was done. I'm sure my mind wasn't the only one in which the news of the first smart bomb sealing the exit and the second bomb incinerating the victims raised visions of the Auschwitz gas chambers. But who was the perpetrator? The man who set the hairlines and pulled the trigger was just following orders. Of course, he didn't know there were civilians in there. He probably thought they were Iraqi soldiers, the Gulf War equivalent in some ways to the cattle of the above analogy. George Bush? Well, ultimately he was responsible, in a way, but he sincerely believes that his motives were pure. At least I think he's sincere in that belief. And he believes that Saddam Hussein was guilty for having cunningly, quote, placed civilians in harm's way for propaganda value. And in war you get collateral damage, right? It's regrettable, but war's hell. So one man's evil is another man's accident. In any event, all the likely candidates for main perpetrator deny it, which is my point. To bring it even closer to home, how many of us have ever spent more than 20 seconds examining the literally murderous implications of our addiction to cheap gasoline and have anything effective about it? This addiction causes untold human and ecological damage, but we won't take responsibility for the consequences. Are we evil? Nobody likes to examine his or her life practices to the point of recognizing the evil that they cause and making the indicated changes. So the evil continues. Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And I would expand that to a 1991 version. The unexamined life creates and perpetuates evil. Regarding proposition number 3, evil is systemic. The Holocaust resulted from a two-pronged system. The first prong was the resentful scapegoating ideology directed against the Jews, an ideology that was shared in its radical final solution form by relatively few Germans. The second prong was the web of terror, disinformation, and carefully orchestrated patriotism directed at the Germans. To actively resist the evil that everywhere of to one degree or another meant to become one of its victims. Similarly, soldiers who resist executing orders they know will result in civilian deaths, unnecessary deaths, therefore evil, such soldiers face certain harassment, vilification, and probably formal punishment. People tolerate or perform inhuman acts and practices simply because they belong to systems that institutionalize inhuman principles. Who is the real perpetrator? When René had his Nazis proclaim at the end of the film, "I am not responsible," and then asked, "Who then is responsible?" he was not only challenging their honesty, he was also asking this larger systemic question. And recall that one of the participants here asked the question after that film, is civilization responsible? Well, maybe, or to some extent. If it is, what are we going to do about it? Or is that just up to the Germans? Regarding proposition number 4, war creates and exacerbates evil. The Nazis would have had a much harder time pulling off the Holocaust in peacetime than in the middle of a war. Wartime rules on information exchange are much tighter than in peacetime, even a totalitarian peacetime. No foreigners are around to stumble onto embarrassing secrets. Press restrictions are more stringent than ever. The unpatriotic attitudes, like wondering what's making all that smoke, is greater than ever. And greater than ever, too, is the felt need to contribute to the survival of the homeland or its vital interests, like cheap oil. To condemn German civilians, or even most German soldiers, for Nazi government policy during the war betrays both a mean streak in the accuser and an ignorance of war's modus operandi. War promotes evil by chewing up people and their consciences. Now, it seems to me that all these and like considerations are necessary elements of any real consciousness about mass-scale human evil. Thus, the question of present-day German consciousness of the Holocaust must be asked in this larger context. Have the Germans learned their lesson, which is a question that I think many Americans and other non-Germans have in mind when they ask about the current attitudes in Germany about the Holocaust. That question, have the Germans learned their lesson, unavoidably then will give way to the more intelligent, what lessons can we all hope to learn from the Holocaust, and how are we all, including the Germans, going about it? One of the finest examples of searching for and grappling with the Holocaust's lessons is the address to the Bundestag by German President Richard von Weizsäcker on May 8, 1985, the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II. News coverage of Germany at the time was preoccupied with the Bitburg flap that Sterling will be telling you about. So this masterpiece of soul-search conciliation, Weizsäcker's landmark plea for the responsible application of historical knowledge and the faculty of memory on which it rests, received far less attention than it deserves. I'd like to read some excerpts to you. Although they necessarily give only an incomplete picture of the entire scope of the speech, which was over an hour long, I think you will agree that Weizsäcker speaks not just to Germans, but to and for us all. Found quite a bit. I mean, this is in consecutive order, but there are huge gaps among the quotes that I give you. The 8th of May is for us Germans, above all, a day of remembrance of human suffering. It is also a day of contemplation on the course of our history. The more honestly we observe this day, the freer we will be to face its consequences responsibly. By the way, responsibility is perhaps the most important concept that Weizsäcker deals with in this speech. At the end of the war, we looked back into the dark abyss of the past and forwards into an uncertain but likewise dark future. But with each passing day, this truth came clearer, a truth to be stated on behalf of all Germans today. The 8th of May was a day of liberation. On this day, every one of us was liberated from the National Socialist regime of violence and its contempt for humankind. The 8th of May is a day of remembrance. Remember, the German word is erinnern. Doesn't have a hyphen in it in German, but I'll put it there for emphasis. To remember, erinnern, means to recall an event so honestly and undistortedly that it becomes part of one's own inner being. This internalization presents a stiff challenge to our truthfulness. We mourn today all victims of the war and the tyrannical regime. Most particularly, we commemorate the 6 million Jews who were murdered in German concentration camps. We call to mind all the peoples who suffered in the war, commemorating especially the countless citizens of the Soviet Union and of Poland who lost their lives. As Germans, we mourn our own compatriots who died as soldiers in air raids here at home, as prisoners, as expellees. We commemorate the murdered Sinti and Romani gypsies, the homosexuals, the mentally ill, and all whose lives were sacrificed because of their religious or political convictions. We commemorate the hostages who were executed. We commemorate the victims in the resistance movements of all the lands we occupied. As Germans, we honor the memory of the victims among the German resistance movements, whether civilian, military, or religious, the working class and trade union resistance, the communist resistance. We commemorate those not part of the active resistance, but who preferred death to the betrayal of their conscience. Alongside the masses of the dead, there looms a mountain of human suffering, grief on account of lost loved ones, suffering and crippled, suffering caused by barbarous forced sterilization, suffering in the nightly bombings, suffering caused by flight and expulsion, by rape and pillage, by forced labor, by injustice and torture, by hunger and hardship, by fear of arrest and death. Grief at the loss of everything we had falsely believed in and worked for. Today we recall to mind all this human suffering and commemorate it in grief. It is true that hardly a state exists today that over its history has remained innocent of involvement in war and violence. The genocide committed against the Jews, however, has no precedent. The perpetration of the crime itself was in the hands of a very few. It was concealed from the eyes of the public. But all Germans were witness to what their Jewish fellow citizens were forced to endure, ranging from cold indifference and camouflaged intolerance to open hatred. Remain unsuspecting after the burning of the synagogues, the plundering, the stigmatization with the Star of David, the deprivation of rights, the incessant violations of human dignity. Anyone with open ears and eyes, anyone willing to seek information, can hardly have been unaware that the deportation trains were rolling. True, the manner and the extent of the extermination surpassed human imagination. But in reality, the crimes themselves were augmented by the willing together too many people, including people of my generation, young and uninvolved in the planning and carrying out of events, their willingness to ignore what so obviously was happening. There were many ways of ignoring one's conscience, of denying jurisdiction, of averting one's eyes and sealing one's lips. And when at the end of the war, the whole unspeakable truth of the Holocaust came to light, far too many of us took refuge in the claim that we had not even imagined any of this, known that it was happening. There is no such thing as guilt or innocence of a whole nation. Guilt, like innocence, is not collective, but personal. The great majority of our present citizenry either were children during those years or were not yet born. They cannot profess a guilt of their own for crimes they did not commit. No sensitive person would demand that they do penance merely for being German. But their forebears have left them a legacy. All of us, guilty or not, old or young, must accept the past. We are affected by its consequences, and we are liable for them. Young or old, we all have the obligation and the ability to help each other understand why it is vital that we keep our memories alive. It is not a question of coming to grips with the past or exorcising it. No one can do that. The past cannot be modified or undone. But close their eyes to the past, become blind to the present. Whenever we refuse to remember inhuman realities, we risk being reinfected by them. And then he quotes from a Jewish source. Exile is only lengthened by seeking to forget. The secret of redemption lies in remembrance. I think that's what Bernd Jager was referring to last week. This oft adage surely expresses the idea that faith in God is faith in the work of God in history. Remembrance is the experience of the work of God in history. It is the source of redemption. This experience creates hope, creates faith in redemption, in reunification of the divided, in reconciliation. If we forget this experience of God's work in history, we lose our faith. If we Germans were to try to forget what happened rather than to remember it, we would not only be acting barbarously, we would offend the faith of the Jews who survived and destroy the foundation of the reconciliation we seek. We need to create a memorial of thought and feeling in our own hearts. Then, reviewing the events of the last 40 years, which have witnessed the growth of German democracy and respectability in the world, Weizsäcker continues, we certainly have no cause for arrogant righteousness, But we can look back with gratitude on the developments of these 40 years if we use our own historical memory as the guideline for our actions in the present and for the tasks that lie before us. When we recall that mentally ill people were put to death in the Third Reich, we will see as our own responsibility the care of people with psychiatric disorders. When we recall that those persecuted on racial, religious, and political grounds and facing certain death often were met by closed doors at the borders of other countries, we will not shut our own day to those who are genuinely persecuted and seek protection with us. When we reflect on the penalties for free thinking under the dictatorship, we will protect the freedom of every idea and every criticism, however much it may be directed against ourselves. Whoever would judge the current situation in the Middle East should recall the fate to which Germans subjected their Jewish fellow humans, a fate that led to the founding of the State of Israel under conditions which continue to burden and to endanger the people of that region even today. He was speaking in 1985, but you get the connection. This is the concluding part of his speech. In Germany, a new generation has grown into political maturity. Our young people are not responsible for what happened over 40 years ago, but they are responsible for the historical consequences. What we of the older generation owe our young people is not the fulfillment of dreams, but honesty. Our is to help them to seek historical truth soberly and objectively, taking refuge neither in utopian panaceas nor in moral arrogance. From our own history we have learned what depths humankind can stoop to. Therefore, we dare not assume that we have now become different and better humans. There is no such thing as moral perfection achieved once and for all, not for anyone, not for any country. We have learned as human beings we shall remain in jeopardy. But we have the strength to overcome again and again the dangers we face. Hitler's way was to stoke prejudice, enmity, and hatred. What we ask of our young people today is this: never let yourselves be driven to enmity and hatred of other human beings, of Russians or Americans, Jews or Turks, of radicals or conservatives, of blacks or whites. Live with each other, not against each other. Expect of us, too, as democratically elected representatives, that we take these precepts ever to heart and that we set an example for others. Let us honor freedom. Let us work for peace. Let us respect the rule of law. Let us be true to our own ideals of justice. On this 8th of May, let us face the truth as best we can. Coincidentally, I got a newspaper today with a picture of Richard von Weizsäcker on it. You can look at this later if you like. I would so love it if our own president could give speeches like that.
Would it be possible for you to get copies of that speech for us?
It would be possible for me to let you know where to get them and for you to get them yourself. They're available from the German consulate in San Francisco, buried in it, which includes various speeches about the Holocaust, including a couple by Ronald Reagan. Sure.
I'd like to look at it.
Okay, I'm going to talk to you today about memory of all things, remembering memory of the Holocaust, and also I want to address the degree to which we focus on anti-Semitism, I say we, in Germany. Marcel Proust once said, "Reality takes form only in memory." And yet, if you visit Buchenwald, as I did in the summer of '7, you are struck with a kind of unreality because there was no mention of Jews at the museum at the site in Buchenwald. At Babi Yar, the 100,000 victims listed there are listed only as citizens of Kiev and as prisoners of war. And the monuments to the dead at Treblinka and Auschwitz make no reference to the religious identity of the people or why they suffered. So if somebody asked me today to explore my own memory of the Holocaust and asked me to what extent I focused on anti-Semitism in my life, I would be hard-pressed. I don't think about it a great deal, although I'm convinced that the Holocaust is the single most important event that happened in my life. So I want to ask you, how many of you think about the Holocaust during your day? With the capital H, the Holocaust. Focus on anti-Semitism during your typical day. Would you raise your hands if you do those things? Well, that's, you're better than I am, is the point of that, I guess.
How many Jews are among us?
That's a good point, too. Maybe some of you saw the small article in the Press Democrat for February 6th of this year. The Anti-Defamation League recorded 220 anti-Semitic acts in California in 1990, and 63 of these were in Northern California. In all of California, there were 1,187, the fourth straight year of increases. In 1977, the Bosman study in Germany asked youth what they thought Hitler did to the Jews. Here are some of the answers. Those who were against him were called Nazis. They put the Nazis into gas chambers. That was a 13-year-old. I think he also killed some Jews, said a 13-year-old. And another, he murdered some 50,000 Jews, a 15-year-old said. And the last person, Hitler himself was a Jew, and that person was 16 years old. The Allied occupation authorities took a poll in 1946 and found that 18% of Germans were intensely anti-Semitic, another 21% were moderately anti-Semitic. In '76, 30 years later, the Silberman poll found 15 to 20% of West Germans strongly anti-Semitic, another 30% with various degrees of latent anti-Semitic attitudes. So again, what I'm going to do is discuss certain attitudes. I'm going to discuss current attitudes towards the Holocaust in Germany, but also I've given you some keys to help you interpret, and they help me interpret to what extent Germans are confronting the Nazi past and to what extent they are not. So you have the list in front of you. There are, I think, 10 of them currently. Or what are there? How many of them are there? 8. Gee, I need a copy of that. Is there another copy around somewhere? You can look on with here, huh? Okay, good. 8 now, good. And they are, which of the following things is happening? The person or event which I'm about to tell you about, or the discussion I'm going to tell you about is number 1, overtly anti-Semitic. 2, reinterpreting German history in such a way as to lessen guilt for genocide against the Jews. Is masking anti-Semitism behind impatience and anger at having to continuously face the question of the past. Is relativizing through historical comparisons, hence downplaying the importance of the Holocaust. Is an example of government bureaucracies or government leaders or spokespersons or courts overlooking criminal cases of anti-Semitism in the name of a higher cause, for example, the Cold War. And is an example of the Christian doctrine of forgiveness in the service of anti-Semitism, or is showing an erosion of historical memory and a desire to have the past press less demandingly on contemporary consciousness, or is defending against the dilution of memory, but also is an attack on the political right and their suspected or alleged nationalistic agenda, hence a question of motivation in the critic who is on the political left. Is he in some way forgetting the Holocaust in engaging in political jousting? So the first example that I'm going to give you is an easy one, a grisly one. First event is from a photograph from Der Spiegel. It's a horrifying photo of on the side of a Polish barn, written in Polish, "Too many Jews and too little soap available." And the key to that is obviously number 1, right? Overtly anti-Semitic in a horrifying way. The next is a film, a video, that you can get at Video Fever in Sebastopol for $3.18. Hotel Terminus, The Life and Times of Klaus Barbie, a documentary about this Gestapo captain and SS interrogator, also known as the Butcher of Lyon. Wanted for murder and torture. The CIC, which is the forerunner of the CIA, disappeared him, whisked him away, and used him to set up the counter-espionage network against Soviet agents at the end of the war. Then he was passed on a thing called the Rat Line through Rome with the help of a priest running it in Rome. Barbie and other people like him were funneled through Rome, down the Rat Line into South America, and then he became involved in organizing death squads in Bolivia. And you probably read just today, or was it yesterday, that the United States government has frozen $100 million to the Bolivian government because the new chief of anti-drug operations was a close associate of Klaus Barbie. So what does that fit? The key to that is what would you say for that one on the list? Number 5, I would say number 6. Maybe I copied it down wrong. Number 6, I am wrong. Maybe I'm at the wrong place, but number 5 is obviously the answer. Yeah, number 5. So the next one is a movie that is, I think, possibly still playing in San Francisco called Nasty Girl. It's about a young woman who is lionized by her town for winning essay contests until she decides she wants to write about the Nazi past or her town's involvement in the Nazi area. And then she's blocked at every turn, denied access to archives in the library, a communist, a Jewish whore, and vilified by the town's elders. Eventually her house is bombed. The answer to that would be, or the key that might help in that would be, obviously number 1 and maybe number 3, anger at having to face anything from the past. So for 35 years after the collapse of the Third Reich, there was a dominant mythology called Stunde Null, or 0 hour, which was this term for wanting to turn the clock back to 0 and start over with a new national identity. And revisionism began. It went like this. The Nazis were not truly German. They were sort of demonic intruders who threw Germany off its historical course. And by wiping the slate clean, Germans could look forward to a clear conscience. And another term for this was normalization, an attempt to break out of the entanglement of guilt. The Bitburg affair is a story about normalization trying to break out of the entanglement of guilt. The political background is that in the spring of '85, the Christian Democratic Party, Kohl's party, was facing elections in North Rhine-Westphalia, and the idea of President Reagan coming to Bitburg and would show kind of reconciliation, friendship, moving ahead, leaving the past behind, a kind of rehabilitation, and that would have been, of course, immensely beneficial to the Christian Democratic Union, his party. The slogan for this period was freedom from totalitarianism. The whole visit raised questions, since it was going to be at a military cemetery. It raised questions in the Senate. There was a debate in the Senate about whether Reagan was doing the proper thing about going there, and the faction leader of the CDU, Alfred Dreger, wrote senators in the U.S. who had done some protesting, and he intimated that soldiers buried at Bitburg had fought against the Soviet hordes, the communists who had rushed in from the east, and they had been to fatherland. In fact, they had fought the right enemy. They were simply on the wrong side at the time. And then Reagan and Kohl lay wreaths at the cemetery. The trouble was that 49 of the graves were the graves of SS men. One of them was quite young, but nevertheless there was symbolism. Reagan said, "We can mourn the German war dead today as human beings crushed by a vicious ideology." And ideology in his vocabulary possibly had a familiar ring to it, and he suggested that young German soldiers were just as much victims of the Third Reich as the Jews were, and that the greater menace perhaps had been communism all along, is the intimation. Now, a critic on the left, Habermas, who's a professor of philosophy, at the University of Frankfurt commented, at deeper levels, this anti-communism is linked to those, I think he was talking to, well, both of them, I guess. This anti-communism is linked to those residues of anti-Semitic feeling which the men with their little briefcases in the dining cars between Frankfurt and Munich have given vent to in recent weeks with renewed unself-consciousness. And here Habermas is referring to conservative historians like Joachim Fest, among others. In Germany, Habermas writes, the kind of anti-communism that has recently justified the tendentious selectivity of our reconciliation efforts has always been linked to the darkest resentments. And I assume he meant at having to carry the burden of guilt and having to forego an untainted national identity. But Habermas's language may show his focus, the focus of his concern, to be more on the men with the little briefcases, kind of an ad hominem. You know, he's taking on political opponents, the people on the right, perhaps, or conservatives, however we want to call him. And so I would have to give him a what? A number 8. Yes, very good. The dilution of focus on anti-Semitism by being involved in this struggle. So, President Reagan also spoke at Bitburg, at the U.S. Air Base at Bitburg, and he said, "We do not believe in collective guilt. Only God can look into the human heart, and all these men have now met their supreme judge, and they have been judged by him as we shall be judged." And so here Reagan is displaying a kind of theology that he has. He shows that he understands God's thinking, because he seems to have said that. And I think category 6 is, it's number 6 helps. Christian doctrine of forgiveness, unwittingly perhaps, in the service of anti-Semitism. So now you do it. Which key applies to the next one here? Cardinal Joseph Höfner, in his sermon of May 8th at the Cologne Cathedral, said, "We should not again and again exhume the past guilt and mutually committed injustices in constant self-torment. We should not constantly weigh guilt against guilt and use it as a weapon, one against the other. All guilt is abolished in the mercy of Jesus Christ, who taught us the prayer, 'Forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us.'"
6.
Good. Roy Eckhart, a visiting scholar at the Center of Hebrew Studies at the University of Oxford, wrote, "Christians, as past and present victimizers of the Jews, ought to be infinitely wary of propagating the idea of forgiveness for anti-Semitism, especially for the wholesale murder of Jews." And John Dryden once wrote, "Forgiveness to the injured doth belong." Malvin Call, reporter, the New York Times, May 14th, visited the cemetery the morning after Kohl and Reagan had laid the wreaths. He found that 6 feet to the left of where the president's wreath stood was an equally impressive one. Across the banner, "To the Waffen-SS who fell at Leningrad." And a foot to the right of Chancellor Kohl's wreath was another wreath, and it said, "For the fallen comrades of the Waffen-SS." These 2 wreaths had been put in the chapel out of sight hours before the president arrived, restored to their original place hours after he left. President Weizsäcker, that Philip read to you about, or read from, said, I just would skip that, because you know what he said in his wonderful speech. So now what would you choose for this one? At the same time, Rudolf Augstein, who was the editor-in-chief of Der Spiegel, wrote, "It is not at all certain whether the anti-Hitler allies committed fewer crimes against humanity than Hitler." And he cited atrocities committed beginning in 1928. He also cited Roosevelt's Jewish Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, who developed plans to reduce Germany after its defeat to an agrarian state. And also he mentioned Theodor Nathaniel Kaufmann, who way back in 1941 was the president of the American Peace Society and had advocated the general sterilization of the German population in order to bring about its disappearance. In other words, Augstein is intimating not all Jews were good either. So which key would fit here? 4, I would say. 4. Okay. Then Kalb went out afterwards and interviewed people in Bitburg, and a 20-year-old man said, "We Germans and Americans have been cooperating very well until the Jews began to make trouble. Another person zeroed in on Elie Wiesel. Imagine the nerve of a Jew lecturing President Reagan. I saw him on television making trouble the way they all do. An old woman complained that Reagan had stayed only 8 minutes in the cemetery. You know, it had to be cut back because of the Jews. A man with a cane stopped and said, if they don't like it here, the Jews, let them go away. We were better off without them in Germany. And when he was reminded that there were 28,000 of them left, he replied, too many. The aftermath of the Bitburg affair was the great Historikerstreit, or the battle of the historians. Professor Hillgruber, in April '86, wrote a book. In it, the description of the mass rape and the behavior of the advancing Soviet army on the Eastern Front. 2 million Germans died fleeing the Soviet army, the raping and pillaging and so forth. German historians, Hillgruber said, should be identifying with these troops who were trying to defend civilians and prevent the loss of the country's eastern territories, and not with Hitler or the officers who tried to overthrow him in 1944. A little bit of revisionism going on, maybe. Ernst Nolte, Hillgruber, he said, except for gassing the Jews, Nazi war crimes had ample historical precedence in Stalinist Soviet Union, and that Hitler and the Nationalist Socialists committed the Asiatic deed, precisely because they regarded themselves, the Asiatic deed was the kind of atrocities that Stalin was committing. That was the name that was given to them. They committed these deeds themselves because they thought that they would be potential victims of the Asiatic deed. In other words, they to do it. They were caused, the Asiatic deed, or the fear of it, caused them to commit mass murder. I would give that a what? Maybe 2, maybe 4, something like that. Now the recent press, I'm afraid I'm running out of my precious time here. Would you grant me 5 minutes extra? Thank you. I'm going to race, I guess, here. Let's see. Okay, so an article in Die Zeit for December 28th. I'll just tell you briefly what's in these things. If you were a descendant of Jews who fled Hitler's Germany 50 years ago, and you went further and further east until you got to the Soviet Union, and then you had children, and your children now had passports, they would be stamped, where nationality would be stamped, it would be stamped Jew. And the laws for immigration in Germany do not, for asylum, do not apply to people who do not have a nationality. Therefore, Jews in the Soviet Union cannot become citizens of Germany, even though they had German parents or grandparents. However, if they had, your grandparents or parents had been a member of one of the pan-Germanic clubs in the Third Reich, they could be accepted back as a citizen. Or if your father had been in the SS, you could come back, which is. Has
that been changed, however, recently?
Then you know more than I do, and we can move on. Okay. Let's hope that it's changed. Yeah. Although I read this very recently in the site, so maybe. The use of poisonous gas in the Middle East has brought a series of articles. CNN has reported, as you may know, February 1991, that 134 German firms had contributed materials to the production of poisonous gases and other weapons from all countries, 336. There was a group in Germany, a firm called Rhein-Bayern Fahrzeugbau. They had shipped chemical labs to Iraq, mobile chemical labs. They were associated with the Karl Kolb firm, and this firm is under investigation now for poisonous gas-producing agents to Saddam Hussein. The Karl Kolb firm advertising slogan was, "In the service of humanity through the contributions of science." More articles discuss the involvement of German business in the East, in the Middle East. The laws of terrorism are very, very strict. Even if you even wanted to commit a crime, you can be indicted under the terrorist laws. However, that applies to protect the Middle East or Israel from German merchants. the loophole that they're escaping through is Article 103, paragraph 1 of the Penal Code, which states, an act is punishable only if there already exists a law which prohibits the act, and there's no law against selling pesticide manufacturing equipment. Here's the loophole. If a person commits an act without realizing it, that he or she is doing an injustice, the person incurs no guilt. If the person could not mistake, that's the. And then Günter Grass writes a wonderful essay called Schreiben nach Auschwitz, Writing After Auschwitz. It's a very important piece. He talks about Theodor Adorno's idea that it's impossible, it's barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz. He links it to the final solution. He essentially is talking more about one writer's spiritual and existential crisis rather than as real results of anti-Semitism when he talks about Holocaust. And then there's a funny thing happening in the Wolf Biermann writes a wonderful article in which he assails the left. He even invokes the name of Inge Eicher-Scholl, the sister of the beheaded student resistance fighter in Munich, and saying that there is a time to resist. The pacifists don't want to destroy works in Iraq. And he says, thank God for the Pentagon and for the manufacturers of weapons. Thank God for the U.S. interest in oil, because that way Jews will be protected. He says, I'm partisan in this dispute even though I'm no Jew. He tells a story about his father being in the Spanish Civil War, sabotaging ships that were being built, warships. And he was captured and put in prison. He watched his whole family go off to Auschwitz. Finally, he was brought before a judge. The judge asked his name and so forth, and then it came to religion. The judge was going to answer for him. None. And his father screamed, no, I am a Jew. And if he had shut up, Biermann says, maybe he wouldn't have landed in Auschwitz. But he didn't shut up, and he went to Auschwitz. And Biermann writes, as I write, Hussein is trying to gas her for the second time around. Hans Magnus Enzensberger, a very eminent German intellectual on the left, also comes out for the war and says Saddam Hussein is another Hitler, and fascism is reappearing, but it's all anthropological. There's no way around this. The bigger Holocaust is coming, and in a sense he is letting people off the hook through a kind of determinism. You don't have to have a conscience necessarily. Habermas into it. He says Enzensberger has gone too far. Auch so kann man die Väter und die Großväter exkulpieren. Habermas writes, this is another way you can exonerate the fathers and the grandfathers. Inge Eicher-Scholl comes in and says Wolf Biermann should not talk about her sister, that he doesn't know that violence is not a way to solve crimes, problems, international problems. And then to conclude, I wrote 20 friends and acquaintances, Germany, and a long letter about Holocaust and genocide, and asked them to talk about remembering and about anti-Semitism, current anti-Semitism. One, a 26-year-old medical product salesman, said, I don't feel guilty for this past, but I do feel responsible for the future. This is how I'm different from young Americans and other Europeans. We carry this burden constantly and are always reminded of it. In my opinion, he wrote, there are few examples in history of repeating directly and completely the genocides they are responsible for. Other peoples look inside themselves and see no shadows whatsoever. This is not the way we are. His friend, someone I didn't even write, wrote me, and he said that he thought that genocide was genetically programmed, a kind of Darwinian formula, the strong vanquishing the weak. And he said an article about, which from the Spiegel, long article, which was the foundation of the inevitability of genocide. And then a wonderful man, a professor of German in the Technical University at Dresden, whom I got to know last summer, spoke about Holocaust, but with a small h. And he sent me an article he'd written about the American and British bombing of Dresden, which Dresden was demolished and is talked about as a Holocaust by Germans. He told about being a 17-year-old soldier, German soldier in France in 1944, and how he could not understand the deep hatred of the French toward him. He told how he ran wounded through a village between the German lines. An older woman gave him a glass of water, a French woman, and told him how to get back to the German lines. And then smiled and showed her appreciation when he told her where the Americans were. And he said the pilots who were dropping the bombs on Dresden had not had an opportunity to be close to the people that they were killing. Sort of lines what you were saying there. And then, but he never mentioned anti-Semitism in his letter. Another friend of mine, a doctor, a brilliant man, spoke of the possibility of intentional poisoning of the poor and the third world peoples in general by the producers of chemicals and other products which cause environmental pollution. And he also did not mention Holocaust, Jews, or anti-Semitism. The fourth letter is the one I'm going to end on, and the most interesting one is from a recent friend, a psychiatrist. His parents sent him and his brother to deliver medicine for a father who was a country doctor. It was May 1935. My friend, this man, the psychiatrist, was 6.5 years old. His brother was 5.5. The two old ladies lived in an apartment with slanted ceilings at the top of the building. They invited the boys in and offered them pieces of dried apples. On the way home, the boys deliberated whether they should eat the apples the two old Jewish women had given them. Maybe the apples were poisoned, and maybe the old women were witches, like in Handrettel. And he writes, "Who had poisoned our children's souls to think this way?" he asked. His parents had never talked that way. And then on November 8, 1938, when he was 10 years old, sometime after the middle of the night, they woke up to a terrible sound. Windows were being broken, doors smashed in, furniture and clothing thrown into the street. The homes of Jews living in the town were being plundered. The children stood in front of the Jacob's butcher shop, which was just opposite church. Mrs. Jacob was kneeling 3 feet from us, my friend writes. She was trying to pick up her checkered red and white dish towels. Ernst Scheunert, our 14-year-old Hitler youth leader, stood with his left foot on the towels. Mrs. Jacob, this young, beautiful woman, looked up at Ernst Scheunert with a look I will never forget, sad and serious. And then he goes on, round, flat things were flying through the air. My brother and I went to see what it was. Thin, light gray bread. I broke a piece of it off and put it in my mouth, and it tasted like the wafers from Holy Communion in our church. I later learned it was matzah that the Jews ate on the Sabbath in the synagogue. My friend, the psychiatrist, talked about his anti-Semitic older brother and his 40-year-old Catholic, school-teaching, decent, fair, bellicose, and damned nationalistic sister who said, "It's a good thing General Schwarzkopf is a German." He further, and this is just the end now, I thank you for letting me go over. The Germans who committed the crimes or let them happen did not want to have anything to do with it because they did not let it happen. This is the present tense, do not want to have anything to do with it because they did not let it happen. The Germans who didn't commit the crimes and didn't let it happen because they were too young or hadn't been born yet, my friend writes, they don't want to have anything to do with it either because, as they say, we had nothing to do with it. Both types of Germans want to do business, want to sell weapons, machines, poisonous gas to anyone who's interested. Saddam Hussein, Pinochet, Marcos, Israel, the Pope, to you and to me. There are a few Jews in Germany, he wrote, and this is with a kind of bitter irony and anguish and fear for the future. They should keep a low profile. He means this ironically, he doesn't really mean this. They should keep a low profile. I would not like to be a Jew in United Germany. If they get a little uppity, we will sick a few neo-Nazi kids on them to carve the Star of David into their skin. And then he ends with the following words. I would not say this to anyone here. Beside me, I am a Jew and a Nazi. I am a German and an American. And I call Saddam Hussein and George Bush and Ben Gurion and Helmut Kohl my brothers. even though it's damned hard for me to do it.
I want to thank you for asking me to speak here today and
Speak louder.
louder. Thank you for asking me to speak here today to those people who suffered in the Holocaust. I want to thank you especially.
Louder yet.
I can speak louder. Yeah. I wanted to start with a quotation from a Jewish man who lives in Germany. He's the chairman of the Central Council of Jews in Germany, and he spoke in Bergen-Belsen, one of the concentration camps, in 1985. He said, "All of us are no longer able to live and act as if nothing had happened." And I thought I would tell you, since I grew up in Germany and spent about half of my life in Germany until I came to America, how it was growing up in Germany. I was born towards the end of the war in Hamburg. And when I grew up in the late 40s and 50s and went to school in Germany, there was a wall of silence around us about the Holocaust. We didn't hear about it until I was about 15 or 16. And then in school we heard quite a bit about it in history. And there was a book published by S. Fisher, Documents of National Socialism. And that was a book in which there were reports about the Holocaust. And we later on discussed it until we left school in horrible detail. We learned about it, and it was a shock, as it would have been to anybody outside of Germany, to us, because we had not really known about it, and there were no Jewish people at all among the people that I knew. I met a young woman who was half Jewish when I was about 17, 18. And I spoke today with a friend of mine who is Jewish and who 10 years ago for the first time went back to Germany as the head of the Stanford program in Berlin. We were there at the same time, and he'd been a good friend of mine, very close friend of mine before. And I called him and asked him about his feelings about anti-Semitism in Germany today, and he's gone back every year. And before he went, he had never wanted to go. And he didn't speak German, he spoke Yiddish, and he learned German very, very quickly, and is a professor of literature at Stanford, and so was very enthralled by the German literature, the best part of one of the best parts of the culture. And he said to me, which is what I felt too, that he felt there was latent anti-Semitism in Germany today, especially in the rural population, and that many people often don't even realize when they say something anti-Semitic, because it is, he said, there is a deep layer of anti-Semitism that people breathe in as they grow up. And it comes up when people say incredible things about Jews, and when there are questions about it, when it is pointed out to them, they're very shocked, because I think many don't want to speak in an anti-Semitic way today, but also consciously, I would say hardly anybody does it, because there is this taboo that you cannot say anything negative about Jews in Germany today. And so there's the contradiction that people don't even know, and I only realized that in retrospect there are certain expressions that we used in German colloquially that are, say, anti-Semitic, but we were not aware of it when we grew up. And that's what he called latent anti-Semitism. And that's really all I know about it, because the older generation, my mother was, she was 12 when Hitler came to power and 24 when the war ended. So she was brought up with that ideology, and my grandparents are dead. So I don't, and I never talked with them about it. I have heard from my one grandmother occasionally, maybe once or twice, something that could have been anti-Semitic, and my uncle, but I didn't dare to ask them. I just noticed it, but I didn't dare to pursue it. And yet, at the same time, this grandmother was very, very interested in the theater and had many connections to musicians and the theater in Hamburg, and so was fascinated with the cultural input of Jewish people in the arts. But she noticed that people were Jewish. That's all she really said. But I thought I heard something that was, if I had probed more, would have been anti-Semitic. But I didn't. I was afraid to find that my grandmother was maybe anti-Semitic. I just didn't want to know. I was young. But I wish I had now. And then what happened is that in the late 1950s, Rolf Hochhuth wrote a book called The Deputy, and about the persecution of the Jews and the role of the Catholic Church and the Pope during that time. And that started, as far as I know, the first real discussion in the country. It was then made to a television play, and it was in the theater. Television wasn't so important then yet, but it was in the theater in Hamburg and elsewhere probably too. And then it was translated here and played here too, performed here. And then in 1968, my generation came of age in Germany, and a student movement began, which is called the Student Revolution, the 68ers they are called. That means the people from 1968, and they're exactly my age. And I lived already here then, but I have very many close friends, so I was in constant touch and visited a lot and had a lot of exchange with my friends. And that is when what they call the reworking in German of the past began, when people began to question their elders, and they had a lot of animosity towards their elders. And that is also when many, many things began to be written, documents especially. And I notice now in the last few years that people that have come here, there has been a lot of cultural exchange, especially to the German Culture Institute in San Francisco, the Goethe Institute, that many people have written their life stories or done movies about them and are trying to understand what happened and to repicture, to regraph the images that they saw of these acts of silence around them when they were little, like, psh, you know, these things that we didn't understand. And that didn't only relate to Jews, really it didn't. It just related to the whole affair, to the whole past of the war. I read, in preparation for the talk today, I read, there are many books, as I said, now being put out. I brought some, they're all in German, but those of you who speak German might be interested in them. And one, The Children of the Perpetrators. And it said in there that one woman found out that her father was arrested because he was in the Zentrum Party. So he was not a Nazi, that was kind of a right, but Catholic party, but against the Nazis. And they didn't talk about it because you just didn't talk about it. So they concealed even that. And only later did she find out. And other people found out the role of their parents as people or as not general. And so that I wanted to say to the what they call reworking. There were many examples. There were many exhibits, for instance. I remember an incredible exhibit in Berlin in the mid-60s, maybe 66 or so, about Jewish artists in Germany. And I walked into the big exhibit hall, and it was almost all the German writers, musicians, painters, thinkers, all the people I had thought were German were there in images like this. And in school, and that came to me as I thought about this, we were not told that they were Jewish or half Jewish or baptized Jews and so on. Many of my favorite writers, like Heinrich Heine, for instance, they were all actually Jewish people, but they were, I just read a quotation by him, by Heinrich Heine. He said that the Germanness is so much part of him, he could never lose it. And the famous saying, if I think of my homeland, the sleep escapes me. Und mein Vaterland werde ich den Schlaf gebracht. And that was a very strong experience for me. And since then there have been many movies, many television plays, and so on. And also, my friends, who now were in their early 30s, became to be the judges of the Nazi criminals. So I have close friends who actually were the judges of the people, one of my friends, the husband of my best friend with whom I was in school many years, who actually came and was here at Sonoma State for a while. Her husband had to judge some of the commander of a concentration camp, the commander of Treblinka. And I went, he invited us to come, my friend. He was with a group of judges, and for a whole year they worked on the trial. And I saw the man, and it was quite an experience. He sat there, and then his wife came in, who was the commandante, the commandeuse, as they called her. And here she was in a fur coat, and she had a space. She commanded a space around her, even today, while her husband was in prison for what he had done in his life. She still was very proud and like an upper-class person, and commanded this respect and space and rightfulness, righteousness, rightfulness, arrogance. It was unbelievable. And they did give him the judgment, and he had to go to jail, even though his defendant tried to help him so he wouldn't get such a harsh judgment by saying he had cancer. But these young men, they were all men, the judges, 4 or 5, made that decision, and it was a very hard decision for them. For a whole year, my friend had nightmares, and so he decided not to go on doing these kind of trials afterwards. But they had to judge their parents, practically, or grandparents, although our fathers all died in the war, but generally the parents of the country or grandparents, they had to judge, which is hard to do. And in the book about the children of the perpetrators, you see that many people have psychological problems with dealing with that they come from such human beings that have committed such atrocities. And I don't have that book here today, but if you're interested, I can tell you. And they are all from the Goethe Institute on Bush Street in San Francisco, which has a whole list, and I have one copy of it here, of books on the Holocaust. And today it is so that education about concentration camps is in all school classes. Schools go to visit a concentration camp generally. It wasn't like that when I went to school. And, many Germans are going to Israel. You probably know that. Many Germans go to Israel. There's an organization called Aktion Sühnezeichen, Action of Atonement. And when I was in my early 20s, all my friends planned to go to Israel. I almost did it, but then my mother wanted me to come to America, and that's why I didn't do it. But many people studied Hebrew and spent a lot of time working in kibbutz and trying to rebuild things and help the people of Israel as a way of atonement, if that is possible, but as a gesture to do something. And also, I know that a synagogue was rebuilt by non-Jewish people in Worms, I think, in Germany. And then I saw, when I was in Germany last summer, which I hadn't seen before, that there are signs now in many places which are painful. It is good that they are there. For instance, the really beautiful graveyard in Hamburg, which is a beautiful, beautiful park with old trees and has a main entrance, beautiful park-like area, now has a small sign. Well, you notice it right away. Everybody has to go by it right when you walk in. It says, here, from such and such year to such and such year, there were so and so many hundreds of people that had from the concentration camp that had to work as forced laborers. And then before, this is really awful, before, at first the people that died in the concentration camp were buried here before they were buried at the concentration camp, the first group of people. And there it is. And it wasn't there. I always go to my family's graves when I go there, and it wasn't there a few years ago. And in Berlin, right in the middle of a really, really busy intersection, there are signs, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, all the directions, so and so many kilometers from here, so and so many kilometers from here, and everybody goes by it all the time. So that's what the younger people have done, and that's part of having to live with that, and that they want people to deal with it, to have them be confronted with it all the time. And there are about 28,000, I thought 20,000, but Sterling said 28 Jewish people in Germany today. My friend Larry said that he felt there was no problem of anti-Semitic feeling in everyday life at the present for Jewish people in Germany. And John can perhaps say otherwise he may have had other experiences. That's what Larry Friedlander said. And this book is by young Jewish people that live in Germany and Austria, and they all tell their stories. And almost every one of them said that they were afraid that it could happen again. And one a woman who grew up in America, but her parents were Germans, and so she went back, said that when she went to Germany, sometimes broke out in tears because the Germans were so unfriendly, and she had a list of Schimpfwörter, of words, so not really swear words, but bad words, as we said when we were kids, to tell people to just rebut them when they were unfriendly. But I have to say that they're just unfriendly. It's not just, even they're unfriendly to non-Jewish people just as much, and I've broken out in tears too, coming back to Germany, because it's just the way, not all of course, but there is a harsher tone among the people. So I wouldn't call that anti-Semitism, because that happens to everybody. Officially, the Jews today are protected by the government. When they have marches, for instance, there are Jew groups, they have a torch march, and the police goes in front of them and protects them. They protect the doors to the synagogues too. There is evidently a law that you cannot say, like people do sometimes here, that Auschwitz did not exist. There is a law there's a legal term for that. You cannot, I don't know what that would be in English, but you cannot say Auschwitz did not exist in Germany. You cannot lie about it. And I interviewed one of my Green friends over the weekend. I called him, and he is he's one of the leaders of the Greens. And I wanted to say to what Sterling said, that already last year, the last year that the Greens were in the parliament in West Germany, that they asked that Germany will sell no more chemical or biological weapons. That was their demand. And I think most of the parliament agreed that that should be made to a proposal. I have to look it up, but I think that's how it was. And he said too that he thought anti-Semitism was more of a problem with the older generation than with the younger one in Germany, and that among the younger people there is a strong feeling of anti-foreign feeling in Germany, and that is really dangerous. And it is especially against the Turkish, against the Muslims, and among the Turkish against the Kurdish people. They're all just called Turkish, but actually they're Turkish and Kurdish people, and then the other foreign and dark-skinned people. And so that's very important, and of course that could extend, and I'll come in a moment to how it could extend itself. There are also groups of neo-Nazis that you've heard about, and they have actions in Germany, and so they exist. most people seem to think that they are on the fringe, they are not a real threat, but they do exist. Now, what was a concern for my friend Larry, and what I had heard, I was in Germany twice last year, and also in East Berlin, and also for my Green friend, was that East Germany now, as you know, has been reunited with West Germany. And in East Germany, there is a much smaller group of foreigners. There are only about 190,000 foreigners in all of East Germany, whereas in West Germany, that's about how many are in a medium-sized city, 190,000 foreigners. I don't know if you have that, but it's a very mixed society now. It's not just German people there. There are people from all over the world who work there as guest workers, and then there are also many foreign students. And then there are mixed people, half African, half American people, many from the occupation, and also from the many graduate students from Africa that are there, that have remained there and married German women or German men. And there is a strong mood against foreigners in East Germany, in what was East Germany. And many people are streaming to Berlin now from all over Eastern Europe. And there is an economic crisis in East Germany. I also called up an East German friend of mine, a writer, and he was very depressed. Actually, he had for the first time in his life taken a sleeping pill because he couldn't sleep. He was so worried about finances, which they are not used to. They were in a very safety net before. And money wasn't very important because they had many services. And many young people now feel disenfranchised. And as these people become larger, these groups of people, they look towards nationalism, evidently. That's what I'm being told. It doesn't have to be like that, but that's how it is in East Germany right now. And as they are turning against communism, because they were raised as communists, and the East German government was if you say anti-Semitic, it was always very conscious. The official policy was to be not anti-Semitic. So now, since they're turning against everything in their past, it would be natural that they also become anti-Semitic, because that's just part of the whole thing that they're rejecting from what they were taught. This is the young, disenfranchised people who can, I'm almost finished, yeah, who can't get a job maybe in West Germany. In West Berlin, in the last few months, rents on stores have risen 800%. So if you paid $800 for an apartment or a store in Kreuzberg or so, then now you would pay 8,000 marks, excuse me. And so especially the urban people that now no longer belong to an organization that kind of shelters them, that they find their identity in, would be a danger to become anti-Semitic now. And then evidently, my friend Larry also said that there are now many Jews from Russia coming to Germany, and if they find that they're in competition with these people that are emigrating, there are also many other people emigrating. Many people that came about 200 years ago to Russia are coming now back. They're Germans by heritage. They're coming back now from Poland, from everywhere. They're coming now into West Germany in general. And so they will be in competition with the foreigners from the East, the Turks and all the ones West Germany had. And they think, well, we are Germans, we should get first shot at the jobs and so on. And they won't, because the other people have their civil rights too. And so there is a real danger there. Also the taxes have just been raised. And so that's potentially very dangerous. I have just a few more things to say. And this is really important. What we have learned, I think, from the experience in West Germany, that's how the politics have been, or the policies have been, that West Germany has opened its borders for people that are looking for political asylum because of the experience that they had during National Socialism, as Weizsäcker said, persecution for race, religion, and so on. Therefore, West Germany, this is not very well known. Germany has been very generous in opening its doors to asylum. There's the other side to it too. Many people don't get granted asylum now, and there are whole scandals about it, that the court cases are not real anymore, that they decide beforehand, that people won't get asylum, that in general it has happened. You know, we always criticize everything that is happening. And that's very important, that you are always alert, that one is always critical, that one is always thinking, takes nothing for granted. I think that's the most important lesson we have learned, that we have to have civil courage and not let it come to such a point as it did under the dictatorship of Hitler. There's also, as you know, a large peace movement, a very large peace movement. Recently, there were 500,000 people in Bonn and large demonstrations in Berlin against the Gulf War, a large anti-nuclear movement, very anti-militaristic, in spite of what we hear here, but there is really a different German accent, and people think here, especially when you watch TV and see the old movies. And there are also many people that work on reconciliation with Poland, with France, with Czechoslovakia, and also with Israel. And I think it is important. For instance, I'm part of an organization, the Society for Endangered Peoples of the World, that one of my school friends started about 30 years ago, which has become very powerful and has protected people all over the world, going there by collecting monies, by writing to judges and doing many articles about them, raise the consciousness in the country. And they have worked a lot on the Holocaust. They've also worked on the persecution of the Gypsies, and then in the whole world, American Indians and so on. And that is, I think, what people have learned. It's a society as complicated as this society, you know, with many, many different groups of people. So I think that's what one has to remember. I think there are many more things I could say, but I wanted to also, I was given this at the German Information Center at the Goethe Institute, the Cultural Center. There is a workshop here, and you can pick up one of these. It's called Jews and Germans Living Together After the Holocaust, and it's April 13th and 14th for free at the Headlands Institute in Sausalito. And you might be interested in that. And I also, as I said, I have this very extensive list on the Holocaust. And then, one more thing I wanted to say. This is a very important concept. There is a man, Ralph Giordano, who grew up in Hamburg. He was half Jewish and half Italian. And he wrote a big book called Die Bettinis, which also I know has been shown in English on television, a series of this family in Hamburg. And then he wrote another book with a very important concept. It's called The Second Guilt, or The Burden of Being German. And he calls the second guilt the silence, that people did not mourn what they had done afterwards, that they just numbed and pushed it away. And then, after he had written this book, many, many people wrote him letters and responded to that and told their stories as children and grandchildren of the perpetrators or the people that were in that country at that time. And these are the reactions. So if any of you are interested in this, and if you can read German, that is really, really good. This is Thinking After Auschwitz. It's a collection of essays, which is also might be interesting to you. This is the young Jewish people in Austria and Germany. And I wanted to, I know I have to close, I wanted to just close a Jewish proverb. You're not obliged to complete this task of working on the past. You're not obliged to complete this task, but at the same time, neither are you free to withdraw yourself from it, which is what Prerequisite said too. Thank you.
How long can you make them, Steiner? Because maybe we could ask people to sit quietly for longer than usual. Is that a possibility?
Well, it's a possibility, but there are quite a few things I have to say, and I don't think we would have enough time for question and answers. So I'll be very brief and leave all the things which I have here behind and try to tell you just some of the things which I consider very important. I went back to Germany after I survived 5 death camps and 1 death march, and my primary interest was not just to study documents, but go back to the people who were practiced and see how I can relate, how I can understand, how they were able to assume the roles in the destruction process as they have. And while doing all this sort of work and getting in contact with people who were close to Hitler in all various degrees of service, SS and army and political people, I also have come across a number of others who opposed Hitler and risked their lives for opposing him. So what I'd like to do in just a few minutes, so that we have enough time for question and answer period, is just to briefly tell you what the upshot of some of my research has been. Many of the things you can read in some of my publications, which are available here at the university under my name, so just go to the library and look at it, rather than rehashing things. I'd just like to say one thing which I think is important, that anti-Semitism was not something which was a product of the people in Germany. The anti-Semitism was something which was imposed on the German people by the power elite which was in charge. By themselves, their anti-Semitism was actually receding, was much better, was getting better. People were more integrated, more tolerant. But the remnants of this anti-Semitism was stirred up by Hitler, and there was a resurgence because of the National Socialist ideology. And the resurgence of anti-Semitism made it possible, with the help of ideology, for Hitler to do these things he did. Except one has to understand that Hitler himself, while putting these people to death and systematically exterminating them, was also trying to cover up the specific ways and means which were introduced to accomplish that particular task, namely the extermination. So he used euphemism. They introduced euphemistic terms, deceptive terms, lies, and what have you, to not stimulate the wrath of the people, because if the people had known what actually happened, specifically, the chances are that they behaved just as they have behaved when their own people, namely the incurably ill, were destroyed. And that, I think, is a very important thing, because they stood up and opposed it. Now, obviously, what comes first, the skin or the shirt? So the German people were much closer to their own people than, let's say, to the Jews or the Gypsies or the Slavs. So therefore, we're not that much interested in defending them. But had they known the specifics as to the extermination process, the chances are that they would have not accepted that. Give me an example, what happened in Berlin. In Berlin, for example, the half-Jews were rounded up in order to be sent to concentration camps. And all the families, all the relatives came in front of all the SS people and protested against their being rounded up and taken to the camps. And they persevered and won that. As a matter of fact, the SS even supported them in trying to protect their own relatives. And that was a very interesting sort of historical event, which to me is not a proof, but somehow gives us some notion that to some extent the Germans would have responded had they been told the truth. Now, another thing is, if they wanted to find out that they could do it to some extent. Why? Because publications existed. A weekly paper called the Stürmer was published and plastered all over the place in various public boxes in which these were displayed, so that they could read what actually happened to the Jews, and particularly the Stürmer. That was one of the papers which was very explicit in terms of the fate of the Jews and the Gypsies, the so-called subhumans. Having said that, I'd like to tell you that when I went back to Germany, and last summer, for example, I also thanked President Weizsäcker for his contribution to humanity. I was able to do that because I had a chance to talk to him. And then I also went just to the other extreme, and went to the last surviving adjutants of the Reichsführer Himmler. And quite a discussion in Munich about the present situation of the Jews and the world and the immigrants coming to Germany. But primarily, he was telling me how impressed he was with Václav Havel's apology to the German people for having mistreated the Sudeten Germans after World War II. And after World War II, when I came from Dach, this was one of the first things which I've seen, that regardless whether or not they were National Socialists, active National Socialists, all the people who were defined as Germans were prosecuted and persecuted and put into camps and actually assigned the role of what was assigned to the Jews. And dreadfully mistreated. And some of the people I knew, friends of mine, all that, I helped them, supported them, and saved some of these people's lives because they were not Nazis, they happened to be Germans. And having learned a lesson in Dachau that how not to behave and how not to stereotype and generalize, I just felt obligated, morally obligated, to save the lives of those who were innocent Germans. Innocent Germans because they're not perpetrators. All right, so he was very impressed with what Václav Havel said in apologizing for these atrocities committed against all Sudeten Germans, all the Germans who were still in Czechoslovakia and had not left for the Reich. And then I've told him, that's a very interesting thing that you are so impressed with it. Have you apologized to the Jews and the Gypsies as one of the leading members of the SS? And that, of course, stopped him in the track quite a bit, actually. And so what I'm working on, that I'd like to see that the former members of the SS will apologize. And I'm working on that, and maybe a broadcast this year, which a round table discussion in which this will take place. We are working towards that. So let me just give you a very quick theoretical underpinning. The official policy during the Third Reich was anti-Semitism, which didn't come from below but from above. That was imposed on the German people. Today we have a similar situation, philo-Semitism, which is not at all the sentiment of the people, but the official public policy of the German government, and does not reflect the true sentiment, as I said before, of the German people. And I think one has to be very careful to distinguish between these two. Now, I wanted to be very clear that I discuss these matters with German people whenever I'm there, and I'm there almost every year, and at times for an extended period. I find that they tell me very openly their feelings, because for some reason or another, that's being a sociologist and interview, you get them open up, particularly when you don't attack them, but listen rather than tell them how they should think and feel. So what I found that some of them gave me some interesting jokes which circulate in Germany. And Carl Jensen gave me just recently an article about these sort of Auschwitz jokes. That's what they are called, and it's a translation and textual analysis of Auschwitz jokes. And let me just simply give you a little bit of a taste of that, so that you can find out how anti-Semitism, which supposedly is no longer existent according to the official policy, very much is well and alive in Germany. So astonishingly, jokes about the plight of Jews in World War II are now kind in West Germany. These jokes, which many will no doubt find to be in extremely bad taste, might be said to constitute a form of executioner's womb humor, rather than gallows humor. Whether one finds them funny or not is not an issue. Jokes are always a barometer of the attitudes of a group. Now, I told you before that these jokes, some of which I'm going to cite to very quickly, I've been told myself, and those people who told them to me laughed more than I have, you can imagine. So, all such jokes exist, and they obviously fill more psychic needs for those who tell them than those who listen to them. They demonstrate that anti-Semitism is not dead in Germany. If documentation were needed to prove that point, here's a joke heard in Mainz in 1982. And over the years, I've heard exactly these jokes told by me, some of my acquaintances. By the way, not by the members of the SS. They wouldn't tell me these jokes. But other people, yes. How many Jews will fit into a Volkswagen, a VW bus? 506. 6 in the seats and 500 in the ashtrays. The Jew ashes equation is an all too common theme in Auschwitz jokes. Other aspects of the Holocaust are also found in these jokes. A child plays with a cake of soap. Granny says, "Keep your finger off Anne Frank." The Nazis did experiment with transforming Jewish corpses into soap. That is something which, by the way, I'm investigating. I'm not at all accepting that as a truth. I'm still investigating. As a matter of fact, I have a piece of soap which I will circulate when we'll have time, which precisely may be that, but it needs to be analyzed before we reach any sort of conclusions. Jewish corpses into soap, a metaphor for the conversion of dirty Jews into an agent of. The joke suggests that the child should not play with Anne Frank. In other words, the dead should be allowed to rest in peace. Perhaps it is implied that the younger generation should not play with the products of Nazi Germany. The transformation of Anne Frank into a bar of soap suggests one of the principal themes of these jokes, the reduction, literally, of masses of Jews. And in these jokes we find a condensed Jew who fits into an ashtray or who has been reduced to a piece of soap. Granny, like most Germans, favors cleanliness. Yet, just the child not to touch the soap. We have the clean granny, a representative of the Nazi generation wishing to repress that dirty part of history. Now another joke here which might be of interest to you. 2 Jewish children are sitting on top of a roof near a chimney. A passer-by asks, "What are you doing up there?" "We are waiting for our parents," the children reply. A Jew is walking down the street carrying a gas container with a pipe connecting it to his mouth. A passerby asks, "What are you doing?" "I'm addicted," he answers. Here the problems of guilt. Here the problem of guilt is resolved through an insidious form of projection. The Jews wanted to be gassed. We see a similar device in the next text. Through repression and projection, the joke teller and his audience can pretend that they are not guilty. The Jews wanted such treatment. Why did so many Jews go to Auschwitz? The fare was free. A new scapegoat has been added to the German repertoire, the Turk. And that is something, again, I have experienced myself. I've seen these things. I've been told these jokes. All these jokes which I'm telling you are something which I'm very familiar with. The influx of Turkish migrant workers throughout Europe has inspired a number of anti-Turkish jokes. One might think that the Turk would replace the Jew as the jokes, but that has not been the case, not quite entirely, although I would say that the Turks dominate these sort of ethnic jokes rather than Jewish jokes. I think the Turkish jokes are more frequent than the Jewish jokes, at least in terms of my experience, which may not necessarily be representative. It is instructive to see how Jews and Turks are treated in the same joke. A German Jew and a Turk are waiting in the clinic to see their newborn babies. A nurse tells them that their children have been mixed up. They do not know which baby belongs to which father. The German says, "Let me be in there undisturbed for 5 minutes. He comes back a few minutes later and with great certainty says, this is your child, this is mine, and so forth. The nurse wants to know how he has done this. At first, the German refuses to say, but she presses him further, and finally he says, I went in, raised my arm, and shouted, Heil Hitler. Immediately my son lifted his arm and returned the same greeting. The Jew shit in his diapers, and the Turk cleaned it up. So the mixing up of the children may reflect a continuing concern with racial purity. The German's reluctance to tell the nurse how he succeeded in identifying each baby suggests that he realizes that racist ideology is taboo. Still, he eventually admits that he used Hitler salute to distinguish the true German. The modern twist is that the Turk is identified by the fact that he cleans up after the dirty Jew. All right, I'll stop here because we need a little bit of time for answers and questions. I haven't finished. I'd like to tell you next time just some sort of a paradigm I worked up with Philip Zimbardo in order to better understand the perpetrator and the people who were assigned the role of victims.
For those of you who are willing to stay.
I wanted to say something.
Oh, Ilka has one more word to say here.
I wanted to add that when the East German government fell, the first official proclamation that the newly East German democratic government made was to apologize, to ask for apology for what the Germans had done in World War II in the Holocaust. I don't know how much that was recorded here. Oh, when the East German government fell, the communist government, and the first actually elected people's government was had its first meeting in Parliament, the first act they did was to apologize for the actions of their foreparents of the Holocaust.
Fellow Dwight?
Dr. Beard, if we can agree upon, or if we can agree that anti-Semitism is again on the rise, sort of under the surface like a bad virus, as you and your colleagues have suggested, what would you suggest that we do about it? How can we prevent things from happening again?
Well, if I knew that, if I knew a certain prescription for that, then I think we wouldn't have to worry about our future. Reasonable, good people would accept my prescription, and we would proceed never to treat each other inhumanely again. Other people will have other proposals. The best that I've been able to come up with for myself is that, on the one hand, we need to insist that the people who work in our name, who represent us, are aware of, and to the extent that we can, insist that they follow our moral precepts in the official actions that they take. That's one thing. As regards the most recent event that has been sort of has focused our attention on these moral questions, namely the Gulf War, to my mind, to my interpretation of the whole thing, is protest. So that's one thing that we have to do, is protest what we, in our best moral judgment, determine to be wrong actions and wrong interpretations by our representatives. The other side may be even more important, and that is personal involvement in the creation of peace. Ilka talked about young Germans who go to Israel. I think it's crucial for Americans not just to do tourism when they go abroad, but to do things like the Peace Corps, to get involved in projects that are designed to promote rather than to destroy life and liveliness. My personal involvement in things like that has to do with Nicaragua. And I'm taking a delegation down this summer to help an alternative medical clinic in this village that is the sister city now of Sonoma County, unofficially. The only thing I can say is everybody has to, I really think everybody, look inwards, look into their heart, and pay attention to the question of their own complicity, their own involvement in evil of one sort or another. You know, I certainly don't want to give the impression that I'm trying to rub everybody's nose in guilt. I don't think guilt is a very useful emotion. I am trying to indicate my support for what Weizsäcker says about our responsibility for the consequences of what was done either before we were able to influence it or against advice. You know, we're Americans. I'm an American anyway, you know. I've got to recognize that in my name and with my money, things have happened that I do not support. And part of recognizing that and dealing with it is going out and trying to make up for it in as direct and personal a way as I can. That doesn't answer the question, but, you know, it gives people perhaps something that they can work with.
Let me give you one specific example which just happened to me recently. When I was part of producing the Hitler film, which you will be seeing, there was one driver who, a German fellow who was just about 20 years old and just beginning his university studies. And so when I took him to Dachau, we went to Dachau to take some shots there and elsewhere. He just wrote me recently, he said, I was so impressed with what happened to you and the part of the role which my parents played or some fellow Germans, that I decided to become a conscientious objector and I don't want to be drafted. And I asked me to write him a letter of recommendation, quote unquote recommendation, not to be drafted. So I've done that. And that is one very specific consequence, interaction, information. Why we do, for example, what we do here in terms of the lecture series, to inform people who need to be informed in order to be citizens with conscience and act accordingly. And that's why we do what we do here. And at times it's not easy to do it. You have to overcome a great deal of obstacles, are not really supported too much by the administration. So that's information, discussion, and particularly also not ignoring some of the survivors who had some experience. And very frequently we are more interested in the dead than the ones who survived, because it's much easier, because we may hear things which are not very pleasant to listen to. And that happens to me, you know, I'm always available. But very few people take advantage of the fact that we are, some of us are still around. We won't be here forever. But very frequently we are ignored also by Jews and other fellow Jews, other people ignore us. It's much easier to talk and deal with the dead, because they don't talk back, you know, and they can't tell you anything which might be unpleasant to you psychologically, emotionally, or otherwise.
I think there are many answers to your question in terms of how we will deal with this personally and as a culture. I personally feel that how we educate our young people in terms of changing the direction of society about these values is really important. And that could be gone on great length, but I think that we have a project also sponsored by the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, which also goes into the secondary schools and teaches educators from age 12 to teach children age 12 and up about these issues and to begin to work with them before they even get to the college level, so that it's not a new issue by the time they're 18 or 20. They've already begun to think about it in their lives. This girl had a question.
I'm 25.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that, you know, this is all really painful stuff to hear, and that while none of us would like to hear about our brothers and sisters, maybe Jewish families that were killed in the Holocaust. Likewise, want to hear about our Panamanian families in Panama that were killed, or the, gosh, this is hard, or the Iranian families that were killed. And it's so important that the German people learn a lesson, but no other countries are learning a lesson either. It's really painful.
So that's why we are two parallels. We're just using the Holocaust and some genocidal situations as a hanger-on precisely to prevent similar occurrences of violence, escalation of violence.
But we must keep on trying.
That's right. Exactly.
Giving up is not the answer to the problem.
And I'm very, very touched by you being moved, because you show that you're motivated, and precisely this is something which they try to stimulate, to move people into action rather than be a silent majority, or part of a silent majority. And that's why we are doing what we are doing. And partially also succeeding. I think we've made some progress, and I think we've improved in time. Over the years we've been doing the lecture series. You had something?
I was going to ask, when you're gone and all of the survivors are gone, how do you keep my generation, how do we remember? I know in my own family when my grandfather died, talking about the Holocaust really stopped. And I don't want it to stop, but how?
Well, because you're here and you still have contact with some of the survivors, and some of the people have studied it, so you are the one who will perpetuate that. You will carry the ball, and that you can do. That's why we are doing that. Obviously, we all will die, but what sort of heritage do we leave? We leave the heritage precisely those people will listen, and it will sink in what we are telling them, that something will be understood, something will stick, so that it will be enough of a motivation to act according to their understanding of the situation.
May I have to choose? Fellow in the red.
Follow up on that particular comment. You say you see improvement. Are you talking about improvement just in an anti-Semitic context?
No, I'm talking about improvement in terms of how we relate, what needs to be related during, let's say, the Holocaust lecture series, or in presentations, in lectures, what have you. And I think we are learning how to relate the thing so that it will sink in a little bit more and will be stood, and where we also can stimulate some emotions as we have, and that's good, that's positive, that's creative, because that is a motivating factor which will move you to become an activist and participate rather than sit back and say how terrible.
Debbie.
My heart aches for the Palestinians too, but how do you respond when people compare the Palestinians to the Holocaust?
One of you want to take that?
I think the way out of that trap is not to compare them. I mean, you can compare historically, you have to compare all the time, but two injustices don't have to be like each other in all ways. Also, the confusion, I think, is the Palestinians have attacked Israelis and Jews, and that's wrong. And the Israelis have hurtled towards Palestinians, and that's wrong. So I don't think you have to say, anyone who says the Holocaust is the Holocaust and the injustices to Palestinians are the same thing, it just mushes it together. It's more complicated than that. That's what I think.
I have a question about philo-Semitism. I think two speakers referred to it. One in connection with the German Democratic Republic. You, Professor, discussed it as being the official policy.
Right.
The German government, what we used to call West Germany.
That's right, exactly.
Now, in what form, was there a difference in the form that this philo-Semitism took in the two Germanys?
Well, I think the information, the propaganda, information, I think, is very different, because obviously it's not as ideologically based but more humanistic in Western Germany in terms of the philo-Semitism. People say, hey, we've done these sort of things, we recognize what we've done, and we need to make amends, we need to make a restitution. And I think from that point of view, I think it's quite justified. Except some of the young people who are listening to all these TV and broadcasting say they are being overfed with this sort of thing. Just they don't want to listen to it because of the frequency, because they are being fed this so frequently that they can't absorb it anymore. They're somehow saturated. And that, I think, is a problem. How much do you do in order to tell them, give them, inform them, so that it will not be saturated, but that it will sink in, and they will be able to digest it. In terms of, and there's no ideology other than that very stubborn feeling on part of the government, and that restitution has to be made, and the same mistakes should be avoided. Now, in during the Nazis, there was a propaganda which was based on half-true lies, ideology, which myth and belief systems, which were totally false premises based on prejudice, stereotyping, and labeling. And that, of course, is a very different practice than the practice which practiced.
I asked you in connection with the philo-Semitism. I think every speaker mentioned it in connection with the German Democratic Republic.
Well, that's too early to say, because in the Democratic Republic, nothing really happened. Because there, very little was done for the Jews. First of all, very few Jews lived there. And secondly, they were not at all very sympathetically inclined towards those few who lived. If anything, there in East Germany, there was much more anti-Semitic, official anti-Semitic feeling than elsewhere.
One of these, was quite on the contrary.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear from that.
I don't know much about it either, except I know that the official policy was post-Semitic. That's what I had said, and that it was part of the official stance, as it also was post-Third World people in East Germany.
Well, I dispute that. Yeah, I dispute that, and I don't think that's correct. Yes, you want me to.
Oh, but the East German government did, I don't know, maybe this is what you mean, being philo-Semitic, in that they did offer finally to make a monetary refund or restitution to the state of Israel. And the other question about West Germany is philo-Semitic. They as well have made economic restitution as well as philosophical restitution for individual Jews who suffered cash payments after the war.
That's right.
And they continue to make cash payments to the state of Israel. And this is, in my opinion, a precedent where a state reimburses people who it did not directly persecute. So indirectly, Israelis who are now born profiting or being rich by the German government.
Benefiting.
No one brought that up, and I think that does let me support a little bit of philosophy.
It'll never replace what they lost.
Oh, obviously, that's
all their
exactly. I don't think that any that's why I'm really against even attempting to make economic because lives cannot ever be truly
Can I comment on that? Personally, I think, the West German government, for the steps through which it has gone, we can never go as far as it should. No way to make restitution ultimately the Holocaust. But if they were to do nothing, I think that we would be justified in claiming that they had in any way come to grips, that they weren't even trying to come to grips past, and that they should be expelled for that. And I think that is what attitude that I at least have towards a government until the new democratic government was elected, which only lasted for a few months. That they refused it. That they, as the leaders of the country, were co-responsible for any necessary role in making reparations to Israel. Claimed that their history was one of anti-Semitism, since they were the communists who were likewise persecuted, and therefore they were not guilty. And this is precisely the kind of evasion claiming we all have to try to avoid. Be that the West Germans are doing a better job of evading than the Germans did, and probably than most of us are doing.
That's exactly what I was just going to say, is that officially there's been the policy that they put at the hands of the Nazis just as much as the Jews do. Ultimately, there's been a vacuum ever since, and there has not been a sense of collective guilt in East Germany.
Right.
And it's been my experience, I've been there and recently, Islamophobic and have no conscience whatsoever about this Jewish problem has gone on, and also hurts as well. They have no sense of
not to be anti-Semitic. That's all I said.
When I was little, I go to a day school, and they like dress you're little, stories and stuff that you just can't understand, and you just forget about it.
How old were you, Linda?
I was about 10. And this was drilled in Chicago. I don't know, all the time to being educated, talented in your head, to deal with